Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. There's been a lot of frightening initiatives being floated by those advising and supporting President-elect Donald Trump, and a lot of scary things being said by the President-elect himself.
We've been talking about America's direction, and let's start by talking about race. The share of Americans who say race relations are bad in this country is the highest it's been in decades, much of it amplified by shootings of African Americans by police, as we've seen recently in Charlotte and Tulsa. Race has been a big issue in this campaign, and one of you is going to have to bridge a very wide and bitter gap. So how do you heal the divide?
Well, first of all, Secretary Clinton doesn't want to use a couple of words, and that's law and order. And we need law and order. If we don't have it, we're not going to have a country. And when I look at what's going on in Charlotte, a city I love, a city where I have investments, when I look at what's going on throughout various parts of our country, whether it's, I can just keep naming them all day long. We need law and order in our country. And I just got today, as you know, the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police. We just came in. We have endorsements from, I think, almost every police group, a large percentage of them in the United States. We have a situation where we have our inner cities, African Americans, Hispanics, are living in hell because it's so dangerous. You walk down the street, you get shot. In Chicago, they've had thousands of shootings, thousands, since January 1st. Thousands of shootings.
Well, to discuss this further, we're joined with Vincent Warren. He is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a national legal and educational organization dedicated to advancing and defending the rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's joining us today from New York City. Vince, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be with you.
Vince, so in response to Donald Trump's election, the Center for Constitutional Rights released a statement that read in part, if there's a silver lining to this election result, it is that it is impossible now to deny racism, sexism, and xenophobia, that these have been part of America for centuries. Our duty is to stand together with all those who dissent from this bigotry and to defend and protect vulnerable communities and the rights of the U.S. Constitution. Can you expand on that for us, given what we just heard from the president-elect and what we've heard in recent days since the election?
Absolutely. When listening to that clip, what occurred to me was the question was about how do you heal a racial divide? And Donald Trump, I think, proposed his solution, which is essentially deeper investment in police forces to police communities. Now, that doesn't heal the racial divide. It actually amplifies the racial divide. And what it does is it criminalizes race and it racializes law enforcement. So what we can expect from this administration, even just based on that statement, is a much deeper investment in social control of Black and brown communities. There's no question about it. And I think what's particularly frightening is that he has really garnered a deep support in law enforcement communities. Somehow law enforcement communities, despite all of the progress that we've been making with respect to having law enforcement be more accountable, calling out law enforcement for bad deeds, insisting on prosecution of law enforcement for killings and crimes that they commit. The law enforcement community, of course, feels under attack, as they always do, as power always does when a just demand is made of them. And they found a real friend and an ally in the President of the United States, and one that we haven't really seen since Nixon in 1968 and Ronald Reagan in 1980. So we are back in both, I think, the culture wars and in a space where law enforcement becomes the primary tool of, what we would think about as social control. And I think with respect to the statement, yes, we all know that racism and homophobia and xenophobia are the currency of our country. They have been ever since it was founded. There's no question about that. That's nothing new to us. But I think what it does, what having the clarity of having a president like Donald Trump does to movement groups and folks of us that are really working to build the world that we want, is that it provides a very clear path to fight against. And resistance is one of the key tools that we have in this country to push back against these types of government powers, the state violence and things like that, resistance is going to be a key piece. Center for Constitutional Rights is very committed to supporting resistance, to leading resistance through some of the litigation and advocacy that we do. But that's what the next 4 years is going to be about for us.
It seems as though one of the most powerful weapons in Donald Trump's arsenal is that of disinformation and obfuscating the facts. I mean, it's amazing that he makes up his own facts. You know, he talks about crime, you know, and we are looking at record low crime levels in terms of in all the violent crime categories. You know, there are some outliers. Obviously, Chicago has had an uptick in shootings and murders, as has Baltimore, as has places like Kansas City, Missouri. But these places are mostly outliers when we're looking at the entire picture of the United States in terms of crime. And for President-elect Trump to suggest that Black people and brown people live in hell, or even to insinuate that Black and brown people all live in the inner city somehow, is really interesting. But also, Donald Trump, he has praised the use of stop and frisk in New York City, but he didn't mention, or he even actually pushed back against one moderator in one of the debates, that it was found to be unconstitutional. This is after over a decade of litigation by the Center for Constitutional Rights and the NYC ACLU up there. And your response to this sort of repackaging of proven information?
Yeah, I honestly didn't think that I would be having this conversation in 2016 after, you know, a decade of litigation, a 9-week trial, a 200-page decision from a district court, an acknowledgement by the New York City Police Department that what they were doing was wrong and it was unconstitutional and that they shouldn't do it and no one should do it. Didn't think I'd be having this conversation now in 2016, but I am. Donald Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. And not just with respect to stop and frisk. My sense is that he really doesn't know what he's talking about with pretty much anything. And that has been he's utilized that as his strength. So he pretty much can say whatever he wants. But I want to draw a kind of a clear line around the question of disinformation. Disinformation is a tool of state repression. It is a necessary tool of state repression. So at some level, the facts are, of course, nationally that the crime rate has been steadily going down since 1994. And if you follow how this state has messaged around that fact, they can't move in and continue to use state power the way that they have if they acknowledge that truth. So, of course, they've been denying it ever since 1994, even starting with the Clinton administration. So when the crime bill that came under Clinton, that massive, devastating crime bill that came under Bill Clinton was happening, they were creating narratives about upticks in crime. And in fact, if you remember, for folks who will remember the idea of super predators, these kids that were genetically designed to kill each other and kill white people, that was a narrative that came out of Chicago as well in the 1990s. All of it not true. Crime rates had been going down, but in order for the state to deploy resources to continue to socially control communities, A, Black and brown communities, A, and B, to garner votes of white communities to be able to invest more resources in social control of Black communities, they have to create a narrative that their policies work when they don't, that the crime rate is going up when it's going down, that Black people are living in hell when they're not. And that doesn't mean that there aren't serious problems in Black communities, but all you have to do is look at the Vision for Black Lives put out by Movement for Black Lives, where there are suggestions and concrete visions for how to create better processes in living in Black and brown communities, and none of it involves law and order. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about divesting from law and order and investing in community-based services, community-based control, political empowerment, and creating services that actually help Black and brown people who are in crisis and people who are in suffering, rather than just criminalizing.
The Trump camp has been making announcements this week about who is expected to serve in key positions during his administration, one being Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama. He has been tapped to be the Attorney General under Donald Trump when he is sworn in to be president. This would put Jeff Sessions in charge of the Department of Justice. So what can we expect from Donald Trump and his Department of Justice should Jeff Sessions be confirmed by the Senate, compared to how the Department of Justice operates right now under President Obama? What would be the key differences in your opinion?
Well, Jeff Sessions is a particularly horrible choice because, as people will remember, back in 1986, when he was up for a federal judgeship, he was rejected by a Republican-led Senate because of his racist comments and just horrible things that he said about calling African-American attorneys boys, making jokes about the Ku Klux Klan was fine until I found out that they smoked pot, which he dismissed as a joke. But these things, of course, need to be taken seriously. It says a lot, not just about the character, but I think about the trajectory and orientation of that particular human. Disaster to have him as Attorney General, and pretty much anybody that he's thinking about would be bad. I would want to make the point that attorney generals, over a course of 50 years, you can actually see two different flavors of attorney generals that they come in. One is the attorney generals of the early days, like like Ramsey Clark or even Bobby Kennedy, that really began to focus the Department of Justice activities towards protecting communities, protecting protesters, black and brown communities, civil rights, against this sort of tide of nativism and racism. Or they come in flavors like Ed Meese and John Ashcroft, who are much more law and order attorney generals. I would just want to point out that the Center for Constitutional Rights is going to be taking on one of those attorney generals, John Ashcroft, in the Supreme Court in January of next year. We have probably what's going to be the first and bellwether case against the Trump administration in the direction that they're going by seeking to have the Supreme Court hold John Ashcroft accountable for the rounding up of Muslim and Arab men right after 9/11. And why that's important, I think, is because under this new Attorney General, Judge Jeff Sessions or anybody else, we should expect to see initiatives very similar to the ones that were happening after 9/11. So it's important that our case is going to be argued just before Donald Trump is inaugurated, and our hope is that the Supreme Court will be taking into account how this Department of Justice might be operating over the next 4 years, and begin to take a step to hold attorney generals accountable for massive human rights violations and constitutional behavior. What we are expecting to see, as you do in Republican administrations generally, is either one of two things or both, one of which is just sort of turning a blind eye to the challenges that are happening in the world, so not engaging in police misconduct, pattern and practice cases of police departments pursuing prosecutions of police officers that commit civil rights violations, or worse, which is, I think, what we should be thinking about as well, which is weaponizing the Department of Justice as a tool of social control, rounding up of Muslim and Arabs, branding Black Lives Matter activists as terrorists, and the things that flow from them.
And you bring up very interesting points. Leads me to my next question, because this week a Trump surrogate cited the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II as sort of precedent, defending a registry, a possible registry for Muslims. So your response to this, because as you said, your organization will be arguing in front of the Supreme Court about a related issue, and you've been fighting profiling and surveillance of Muslims post 9/11. So again, I mean, are we really going to see Muslim Americans rounded up and placed into internment camps similar to Japanese Americans, or some sort of other highly unconstitutional action targeted at a specific group?
You know, when you started off talking about how Donald Trump doesn't look at facts and how he thinks of he doesn't really consider the Constitution when he talks about the stuff that he's doing. What his presidency is going to do is enable a range of ideologues to come in the Department of Justice, in Homeland Security, in those various important entities that will likely try to push through. And I think that's an extreme example of internment camps for Muslim folks. It's not out of the range of suggestion, I think they're crazy enough in there to even discuss that idea and maybe even to discuss how it might happen. So it's important to be vigilant. I'm glad that surrogate raised that question, because it's important for us to be vigilant about what's at stake, even if it doesn't get to that. So clearly unconstitutional to round Muslim people up and put them in detention camps. There's no question about that. And at some level, that's beside the point. What I think more important for us is not the constitutional question, but I think the moral and political question. And the moral and political question is for that even to be floated before the administration comes in. And even if the administration backed off from it, the incoming administration, which they did, if that idea has been floated and it's going to gain currency within the United States, and it's important for us, not just as the legal organization that we are at CCR, but for us as civil society to push back against that as vigorously as possible. People will go to jail in this country rather than allow our Muslim brothers and sisters to be rounded up and put in detention camps. I will go to jail rather than to see that happen. That's going to be the civil society pushback that is going to be key. So I don't think it's going to happen, and it's not because Trump doesn't think it's a possibility. It's because I think both civil society, us, and I think the rational judiciary would push back on that so vigorously that it would be a non-starter. And that if there's bad news about our democracy that Donald Trump wins, the good news is that that's another part of our democracy that we will never let that happen on our watch.
Indeed. We've been speaking with Vincent Warren. He is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, the national legal and educational organization dedicated to advancing and defending the rights guaranteed in the United States Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's been speaking to us today from New York City. Vince, we appreciate it. I'm sure you're going to be quite busy in the coming years.
Yes, you sure will. It's great talking to you, Kim.
You as well, and thank you for watching the Real News Network.